All right, everybody, here we go. Some period four, second to last part of the final here next week. So let's learn a little bit about period four. All right, so first key concept is the United States begins to develop a modern democracy, new national culture, and try to define nation's democratic ideals. All right, it's going to become more participatory. We're going to extend suffrage, obviously not to women or African Americans yet, but closer and closer and closer to, at the very least, all white men. Along with that's going to come political parties. All right, so in the early 1800s, we're still going to debate some of the same issues, the tariff, the powers of the federal government, what our relationship should be with European powers. All right, the Jeffersonians want to reduce the power of the federal government. Obviously, the Federalists wanted to increase that. So the Jeffersonians are going to allow the Alien and Sedition Acts to go away. All right, they're going to allow the Bank of the United States to lapse, even though obviously it's going to come back. They're going to remove a lot of the midnight appointments that the Federalists, John Adams, made when he was voted out of office. Obviously, that's going to lead us to Marshall v. Madison. That's coming. All right, it's going to abolish all internal taxes, including the Whiskey Rebellion tax, the tax that started the Whiskey Rebellion, and it's going to reduce the size of the army. They are, however, going to expand the power of the federal government in other ways. Okay, the Embargo Act of 1807, which is then going to lead to the Non-Intercourse Act and all the problems with England and France, which is going to lead to the War of 1812. The Louisiana Purchase, which obviously we spent a lot of time talking about, really forced Jefferson to take a loose interpretation of the Constitution, whereas a general rule he believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. All right, that's going to drive the Federalists into New England to think about secession, which is going to lead to Aaron Burr joining them, which is going to lead to Alexander Hamilton ratting out Burr, and in the end lead to Hamilton and Burr's duel, in which Hamilton will be shot and killed. All right. The Embargo Act, like I said, then the Non-Intercourse Act is going to try to ban and limit trade to try to stop them from interfering with American trade. The idea being, well, since they're impressing our soldiers and capturing our ships, we just won't trade with them, and then they won't do that. And obviously that's not going to work very well. All right, that's going to lead us to the War of 1812, which is opposed by Federalists. The Federalists are centered around the economy, especially Hamilton. Hamilton realizes that a war with Britain is the worst thing that could happen to our economy. Still, the vast majority of our trade is with Britain. The Jeffersonian Warhawks, a lot of them were Westerners. They wanted the war to grab Canada, to grab Florida, to maybe kill the Western Native Americans, should say there, and to expand the country. All right. The Federalists are going to block the War of 1812 in any way possible, both inside of Congress and outside of Congress, sometimes even cheering and celebrating British victories at times. There's even some thoughts that there was some treason going on with the Federalists, the blue light Federalists that supposedly would flash blue lights when colonial ships were going to be trying to smuggle or break the English blockade. So lots of conflict within the country there as well. 1814 Hartford Convention toyed with secession, however, instead decided to propose limiting the powers of the federal government. However, Jackson's victory in New Orleans, we talked about this, is going to create a bunch of nationalism, make everybody yay America. It's going to lead to the end of the war, and it's going to make the Federalists in New England look like traitors, so therefore they're going to back down relatively quickly. All right, in 1860, Henry Clay and James Madison are going to start the second bank of the United States. Again, we have the realization that in order for the country to function, it really needs a bank. Then we're also going to have Clay's American system, all right, which is this idea of expanding infrastructure, canals, roads, building observatories, all kinds of things that Clay wanted to do. Madison took a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which said that the federal government can't do those things, and therefore suggested that we should have a constitutional amendment to allow them. So Madison wasn't really necessarily against them. He just didn't feel the government was allowed to do that under the Constitution. All right, number of important Supreme Court decisions. We talked about all these. Marbury versus Madison, which establishes the principle of judicial review, allows the Supreme Court to determine whether something that the Congress or the President does is constitutional or unconstitutional. Fletcher v. Peck is going to rule that states can't overturn contracts that were previously agreed to protect investors from other states. It's going to encourage cross-state investment because they know that their investments are going to be protected. Dartmouth College versus Woodward refused to allow New Hampshire to overturn the charter for Dartmouth College. They wanted to turn it into a public university. However, a contract is a contract. It was contracted as a private university and will stay that way. McCullough versus Maryland is going to deny the state of Maryland the right to tax the national bank. Maryland wanted to destroy the national bank, and they decided to do it with tax. Remember, we talked about this whole idea of the power to tax is the power to destroy. If you put enough taxes on something, it will go away. The big part about this is it affirms the supremacy of the national government. National laws come first. All right. Also affirms the loose construction, the loose interpretation of the Constitution is the correct one. That obviously is still debated all the way till today. Remember, when we talk martial court, almost every martial court decision increases federal power and the power of the federal government. All right, we're going to get new political parties are going to rise in the 1820s and the 1830s. We're going to get the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson and the Whigs who are going to be led by Henry Clay. And they're going to disagree in a lot of the same areas that the Federalists, the Jeffersonians, and the Federalists disagreed with. So we're going to get the same idea. The Federalists are gone. Republicans are going to split into two groups. We're going to get the Jeffersonians, which are going to merge into the Democratic Republican Party, which will become the Democrats, and then the Nationalist Republicans, which are eventually going to become the Whigs. Again, those political parties really transform a lot over time. Try to keep them straight. The Nationalist Republicans, the Whigs, are going to adopt many of the Federalist positions. Henry Clay and his American system are going to be in the center of that. And the whole idea of a meritocracy, the best should lead. All right, 1824, we had the corrupt bargain. Remember, we had multiple people run, so we didn't really have two national parties anymore. So nobody gets a majority, nobody gets a plurality over 50% of the vote. All right, so therefore it goes to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson was the clear winner, remember. He got the most electoral college votes. He got the most popular votes. But because of the corrupt bargain, we're going to get a new president, not Andrew Jackson, but John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay is going to become the Secretary of State. All right, Jacksonian Democrats, remember, stand for the common man. Obviously, as long as he's white, his record with minorities is not very good. Generally hostile to the banks, generally hostile to federal power, hostile to Clay and his American system, intended to be pro-slave and pro-states' rights. All right, in 1834, we're going to get the second party system emerging clearly. All right, we're going to get people that can't stand King Andrew, and we're going to get Clay, Daniel Webster, Calhoun, who are going to center on this Whig party. Remember, the Whig party really kind of becomes the anti-Jackson party. You have a really interesting mix of people that don't agree on a whole heck of a lot other than the fact that they hate Andrew Jackson. All right, the tariff is going to be a big part of this. All right, South Carolina is going to call the tariff of 1824 the tariff of abominations. They bought a lot of British goods, so therefore they had to pay a lot of taxes. South Carolina is going to nullify. Remember, say that they're not going to follow that tax. All right, they're going to threaten to secede from the Union. Jackson's got to decide what to do here in the nullification crisis. Interruption. Let's get back at this. Okay, so we're at the nullification crisis. That gets taken care of. Clay works out a deal. Our whack-a-mole politician pops up, works out a deal to lower the tariff. South Carolina backs down. Nullification crisis goes away. All right. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster decide that they're going to push Nicholas Biddle to ask for early recharter of the second bank. They're going after Jackson. All right. The charter of the bank isn't due until later, but they want an issue to go after Jackson. So they get Biddle to ask for an early recharter of the second bank of the U.S. Jackson, everyone knew he was going to do it, vetoes it. Clay is going to run on that issue. That's why it was done. Clay wanted to run for president and be able to use Jackson's veto to attack him. Jackson runs and attacks the bank. He's very comfortable with that. He's pretty anti the bank, and he's able to win an overwhelming victory. He then uses his overwhelming victory to start the spoils system. We talked about this already as well, putting people in government jobs as political rewards. They weren't really competent, and therefore we get to this where a new president comes in, fires everybody, puts new people in. Next president comes in, fires everybody, puts new people in. Not a whole lot different than what they do right now, guys. They do the same thing right now. They just make sure they put qualified people into most of the posts most of the time. All right, regional issues are going to trump national concerns as we're into the 1800s, okay? So a couple examples. These are just examples of that. So the Western War Hawks are going to go to war over national interests in the War of 1812 because they want to expand the United States into Canada, into the West. All right, the Hartford Convention puts puts the interests of the Federalist Party in New England above the national history. All right, Calhoun supports nullification, one state, South Carolina's needs over the national needs. Jackson is pro-slavery, so he's going to support censorship. He's going to censor the mail. He's going to introduce the gag rule into the House, which says you can't even talk about slavery in the House, which makes no sense. But they do it anyway. All right, again, putting individual interests above the interests of the nation. All right, John Quincy Adams is going to go after slavery in his post-presidential career over and over and over again, and that's going to lead to the country splitting more and more apart. All right, Polk sacrificed his thought 54-40 or fight, let's go get Oregon, because he realizes Mexico's even better, because Mexico's better to expand slavery, which Polk wanted to do, right? Mexican territory and the Mexican-American War we're going to win is in the South. South equals slavery. Oregon's in the North, okay, above that Missouri Compromise line. So that's why he wanted the Mexican-American War instead of 54-40 or fight. So people are putting individual/state/regional interests above national interests at this time. All right. We're still trying to define what the nation's democratic ideals are and how we change our society to match democratic ideals. All right. We are going to see the beginnings of a distinctive American culture. All right. We're going to get the Jacksonian Democrats and franchise. When they talk about the franchise spreading out, they're talking about the right to vote. So the right to vote is going to spread out among almost all white males. Okay. Appointed offices increasingly become available to all white males as well. Again, I have a little typo there. I'm sorry. All right, religious revivals are going to move away from predestination, because predestination, remember, says that God has already chosen who is going to go to heaven. The religious revivals are going to open up salvation to everybody who wants it and who is willing to do the sacrifices necessary in that individual religion in order to be saved. All right, so again, it's a widening of moral reforms, social reforms, and things along those lines. Okay, the market revolution and the industrial revolution is going to allow more and more luxury goods to be affordable to more and more people. All right, the Second Great Awakening is going to be a big deal, guys. We spent a lot of time talking about that. It's going to create a society that expects Christianity to be the norm, no different than what we have right now, okay? The idea that the norm is Christianity comes out of the Second Great Awakening, okay? Unlike the First Great Awakening, we don't get churches that are going to split and become hostile towards each other. And in the First Great Awakening, we had the Methodists and the Baptists kind of spring up. All right, now we're instead going to have churches that are actually going to compete in a friendly way to help make a better society. And that's all the reform movements we talked about when we did our reformer speed dating on all the different people that are going to come out of that Second Great Awakening. All right. Because churches lead the reforms and not the government, women can be involved. So we're going to start to see women actively involved in what before would have been considered a political arena. These social reforms usually used to be taken care of the government. With the Second Great Awakening, now they're going to be taken care of by churches, and therefore women are going to get very, very actively involved. And we're going to also get these utopian experiments, all right? Transcendentalism, the Brook Farm community, the Oneida community, the Shakers, the Mormons, or all these ideas of creating perfect societies or perfect nodes of society, and as we all can realize, that doesn't exist. All right, this new culture is going to take place in literature and art. Ralph Waldo Emerson is going to take the religious beliefs of America and meld it to create transcendentalism, which we did talk about in the past. Manifest Destiny is going to start to spread this idea that it's our destiny to continue to expand. It's the United States' destiny to continue to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and sooner or later it's actually going to be beyond the Pacific Ocean. All right, we're going to get newspapers and steam presses and railroads and steamboats and canals, which are going to allow ideas to spread throughout the entire nation, and we're going to get less of these regional ideas, and instead we're going to get ideals that spread throughout the entire nation. A lot of reform. Okay, we're going to get temperance movements, abolition movements, women's rights. Again, all those things we talked about in our speed dating are going to really start to take effect at this point. Slavery is going to bound together the South. Okay, slavery is still going to be a really important part, not only the economics of the South, but also the culture of the South. And because of that, we're going to start to see the North and South continue to grow further apart. These liberal ideas from abroad, as well as these romantic beliefs, are going to influence our literature, our art, our philosophy, and our architecture. All right, we got some examples here, guys. You know this is not my strong point, art, culture. I am less of a cultured guy than I probably should be. All right, so this is not my strong point. But we have some examples here of poems, paintings, all right, pamphlets, books, things that you can use as specific historical evidence if we have to write an essay that's centered around culture or art. So this slide really is kind of that specific historical evidence for you. All right. Now, enslaved blacks and free African Americans are going to start to create communities and strategies to protect their dignity, protect their family structures. They're going to join political efforts, and they're going to attempt to change their status. All right. So the Second Great Awakening is going to see the adoption of Christianity throughout the entire country, almost. All right, which is going to give us a common religion, but also a narrative for freedom. Right. You have the whole Israelis and bondage story to the Egyptians, and Moses leading them to freedom. That's going to ring really true, obviously, with the African Americans and the slaves. Obviously, they're going to that is going to ring true to them and make them think, hey, we should have a freedom as well. All right, so we're going to get black churches that are going to form, and the concept of the shout and call is going to transform Christian services, and we're going to get a Christianity that is almost special and unique to the black churches. All right, passive resistance is going to be the most effective response. We're going to see running away. We're going to see violence. Nat Turner's rebellion obviously being the biggest example, but a lot more often it's going to be the working slowly, breaking things on purpose, that kind of thing. All right, the 1830 National Convention in Philadelphia is going to call for free blacks to devise a response to slavery. They're going to come together and say, we're free. We need to devise a response to slavery that pushes for freedom and race equality. We're going to have a push for the abolitionist movement, getting better and better and bigger and bigger and bigger. All right, free blacks are going to support William Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator. That's going to become a major part of the black culture as well. We're going to get the free blacks forming and running the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman being the most famous person involved, but many, many other free blacks were involved in the Underground Railroad. And we're going to get a number of former slaves who are going to speak on a circuit around the North. They're going to write books, they're going to publish articles, and they're going to try to let people know what slavery was like and how terrible and horrible it was. Frederick Douglass being the most important of those freed slaves that spoke on the circuit. The United States is going to continue to be inspired by these religious and intellectual movements, all right, and it's primarily outside of government. These reform movements don't run through the government. They generally run outside the government. Okay, most of this stuff, guys, is stuff that we talked about in the previous slides. So we get the Second Great Awakening, we get the American Anti-Slavery Society and Garrison and the Liberator, all right. The Temperance Society is going to be really, really successful, all right. From 1830 to 1845, in that 15-year span, we're going to see alcohol consumption in America drop by more than half. That's an amazing statistic. All right, we're going to get Dorothea Dix, who's going to form movements to try to have better treatment of the insane and the criminals, and we're going to have the health food movements that are also going to be rampant. Sylvester Graham invents the graham cracker as a health food. All right, it actually used to be really healthy, I guess they tell me. Now it's got just as much sugar as a candy bar almost. But at the time, it was pretty healthy, I guess. Probably didn't taste as good, though. All right. The North is generally over this time going to outlaw slavery. It's going to be completely gone anywhere in the North by 1840, but the South is going to enforce their control of the slavery. All right, remember we talked about the American Colonization Society. They want to end slavery, but they want to return the slaves to Africa. All right, Monroe was actually the head of the American Colonization Society. That's why we get Liberia, which the capital is Monrovia. All right, we're going to get a shift in the argument in the South. The South is going to stop arguing that slavery is a necessary evil. They're going to argue that it's a positive good, and we actually read Calhoun's Slavery is a Positive Good, if you remember. And the North is going to stop arguing that it's anti-Republican. They're actually going to attack it on moral grounds, that it's a sin. All right, Turner's Rebellion we've talked about, and that's going to have a really terrible backlash. We're going to get tougher slave codes in the South to stop that from happening again. We're going to get the gag rule in Congress, so you can't even discuss it anymore. We're going to get Jackson actually censoring the U.S. mail. I mean, that's a pretty incredible step to try to ban abolitionists from spreading literature abolitionist literature throughout the country. All right. However, we're still going to get both white and black abolitionists are going to work together doing all these things that are going to try to lead to the end of slavery. All right, women's rights are going to be a big push. Obviously, the Seneca Falls Convention is something you got to know. The first major women's rights convention. Remember, the cult of domesticity says that women are supposed to stay at home, celebrates them as wives and mothers, but because of the church's involvement in the reform movements, more and more women are going to start to be active outside the home. All right, we're going to start to see women in teaching. That's going to be a major job. We're going to get the Lowell Mills girls. They're the first people really outside of teaching that are going to be hired outside the home. All right, abolitions is going to be a big deal, and it's not going to be a big stretch to go from black rights and anti-slavery to women's rights. All right, so obviously the most important of those women writing anti-slavery tracts is Uncle Tom's Cabin. We talked about how Lincoln says, so this is the little lady who started the Civil War. Really, really important. Can't overestimate how important Uncle Tom's Cabin was to the abolitionist movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott are going to organize that Seneca Falls Convention, and they're going to declare that all men and women are created equal. And Susan B. Anthony is going to become the most effective crusader for women's rights. New transportation systems and technologies are going to expand manufacturing and agriculture. So we're switching in Key Concept 4.2 from kind of that intellectual, moral spread to now more of economy and how the economy changes. All right. The U.S. is the second major nation to industrialize after Great Britain. All right. We're going to see what's called the outwork system, which is going to replace artisans, and then sooner or later is going to be replaced by the factory system. All right. And America's got some big advantages here. They have an abundant natural resources. That's going to be the biggest advantage they have when we talk about industrialization. The Appalachian Mountains are going to allow a lot of downhill water, which is going to allow cheap water power. All right. And America is going to be an inventive society. All right, so they don't have the cheap labor that they often had in Great Britain to start. All right, obviously the South has free labor. We're talking about industrial labor right now. All right, but technological inventions and innovations are going to make that to be a little bit. They can deal with that. All right, we're going to get machine tools and then interchangeable parts, which are going to make things very efficient. The Erie Canal is going to be a big breakthrough and really start the canal boom throughout the North. Once we get the rivers linked together, the invention of the steamboat's really huge because it allows shipping to be able to go upstream effectively. Over time, railroads are going to be the dominant transportation. We looked at how much and how quickly railroads were built, and that's really, really important. And then some other really important, especially farming inventions, which are going to allow the growth of that bread basket, that Midwest area, which is the bread basket of the country, and allow them to be farmed and really start to grow large amounts of food. Legislative and judicial systems are going to support the spread of the industry. It's going to be one of the big complaints of the South, that they see the government often as supporting industry and not supporting them. All right, so we're going to get the protective tariffs, the tariff abomination, which obviously freaks South Carolina out so much, is going to be real effective in increasing the industrialization in the North. We're going to have the federal government building national roads, the national post office. All right, Gibdon's v. Ogden's another important Supreme Court decision, which expands the definition of commerce and allows the federal government to control interstate trade. All right, so states can't tax each other, can't have tariffs within the country, which obviously cause a lot of problems. All right, states are then going to start to issue charters for railroads, having them connect and tying the North together, which we've already talked about is going to be a big reason why the North is going to be effective in the Civil War. All right. Now, all this changes in technology, agriculture are going to change the way society functions, are going to change the way the national and regional identities, right? We're going to have the South, which is going to be that agricultural area, and more the North is going to become industrial, all right? In the North, we're going to have the Lowell Mill girls, all right, which they have chaperones and parents, but it's our first factory labor force, okay? Over time, they're going to be replaced by poor immigrants, mainly Irish. All right, and workers begin working for pay. All right, so they're not living off their own production. They're not creating things for them to use by themselves, but they're actually going out to work for pay. All right, we are going to have really quickly unionization efforts, all right? People who are going to realize that they're being treated unfairly by the government, all right? So therefore, they're going to try to form unions to protect themselves. Even the Lowell Mill girls struck for a while, all right? And that's going to continue. Now, as a general rule, courts are going to be very anti-unions, very anti-strikes. That's going to continue all the way on until the early 1900s. But the one big exception was the Commonwealth v. Hunt, which is a Massachusetts Supreme Court decision, which allows unions and says unions have the right to strike. That's going to be important as we move on. The standard of living is going to rise for the middle class, but we're also going to have a working poor. These people on the bottom, these immigrants who come in and aren't paid very much to work in the factories, and therefore we're going to have a really wealthy class because there's going to be a group of people who are going to make money off these immigrants, but we're also going to have a working poor class that's going to come out too. All right, the rich are going to live away from the means of production. They're going to set themselves apart by their neighborhoods, their housing, their clothing, what they do for their pastimes. There's going to begin to be this culture of the wealthy, which we're really going to see take off next semester in the Gilded Age. All right, the middle class is going to see a rise in income, so we are going to have a middle class. We're going to get three real definite classes in the North. We're going to get the super wealthy. We'll talk a lot about them in the Gilded Age, but we're also going to get a solid middle class and then also this working poor class. All right, and this thought becomes the American dream really comes into focus here. The idea that even the poorest can make themselves into the wealthy, okay? Ben Franklin wrote an autobiography called The Way to Wealth, which becomes a huge bestseller, and it's how to become a self-made man. All right, slaves and the working poor are obviously in the bottom, and it's really tough to get out of that. Again, we have this American dream that even the poorest of the poor can become wealthy, and every once in a while that happens, but for the most part, the poor are going to stay poor, and they're always on the edge of economic failure, just doing enough to eke by. Today we call that kind of paycheck to paycheck. Men and women are going to separate during the day. That cult of domesticity that we've talked about before, the separate spheres, so the men are supposed to do certain things, and the women are supposed to do certain things. That's really going to clarify itself with industrialization. Incidentally, that's what happened in England too, okay? Industrial revolution tends to create a really solid gender roles for men and women. It happened in England, it happened here as well. All right, migrants are going to come into the United States and they're going to settle in different places. So the Irish Catholics are the largest group of immigrants, followed by the Germans. The Irish, remember, often come very poor, so they don't have the money to move anywhere, so they have to settle on the coast. So they're going to fill Boston and New York City. The Germans are going to come into New York. They're also going to come into some of the western cities. The difference is the Germans tend to arrive with a little bit more money, so they actually have the money to start wagon trains and things like that and move to the Midwest, which is why we have such a heavy German population in this area. All right, the Erie Canal and the railroads are going to accelerate that migration to the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys. All right, they're not so wildernessy. How's that for a word? All right, because they have connections to the north. They can go out there and grow food, grow extra food, and actually send it and sell it in other places. All right, so the canals and the railroads are going to make that really big deal. Manufacturing over time is going to move from the west to other big cities in the from the east to other big cities in the Midwest, Cleveland, Chicago, all right, which then are going to draw immigrants to fill the jobs created by those factories. All right. Slavery is going to stay out of the north, but it is going to move to the old Southwest. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and somewhat Missouri as well are going to become populated by slavers and slaves. All right. Slavery looked like it was going to go on the economic decline. We talked about this. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. Again, he thinks that that might actually end slavery because that did the job that the slaves were doing a lot. All right, but instead it makes slavery an economic boon because now they can grow huge amounts of cotton because the cotton gin can get those seeds out and make that cotton workable very easily. All right, so the cotton production is not only going to feed the textile mills of Britain. Obviously, a lot of that cotton is going to go to Britain, but it's also going to go to the North. So don't forget, the Norse industry still has a connection to slavery. Even though they're not directly using slaves, they are using the cotton that the slaves are creating. All right. Britain is going to feed the transportation revolution. The South is going to trade with Britain a lot, which is why they hate tariffs so much. All right, because that trade with the South is going to be instrumental to their economy. All right, and the Northeast and the Northwest are going to continue to get connected more and more by railroads, canals, as well as the commercial ties that bind those two areas together. So we're getting more and more of this North and South division in our country. Less East and West, which is where it really began. If you think about some of the early rebellions, Bacon's Rebellion, it was the frontiersmen against the people on the coast. All right, so we're really switching from a conflict between the coastal East Coast elites and the frontiersmen to now a North-South split in our country. All right. Railroads and transportations obviously are far less in the South. We talked about that. It's going to present a huge problem for them once the Civil War starts. All right. And the South is isolated from the changes the rest of the country are going through. I mean, we talked a lot about how the Industrial Revolution is creating all this stuff that the rest of the country is going through. All right. And they're not involved in that. And that's going to lead to some growing weakness, and a lot of people will say that the South is trapped in the past while the North is creating the future. All right, now that might be a little bit colored towards the idea that the North was correct, all right, but the North is definitely advancing the economy, advancing into the industrial age, where the South is remaining in that agricultural area. All right. There are plans to further unify the U.S. economy. We talked about the American system by Clay. All right. The South does not want a nationalistic approach. They want a regional approach. They want slavery and agriculture to be favored in the South. All right. Jackson is going to support that, and so is John Tyler. All right, those two presidents are going to be very, very Southern orientated. We're going to see that as time goes on, presidents are going to support the North more and more and more, which is going to create that split even more dramatically. All right. As far as our international presence, okay, we get the Louisiana Purchase. That's a big deal. All right, we send Lewis and Clark to support, explore them. All right, and Congress is going to lower the price of the land in the Louisiana Purchase to get farmers to go and settle that land. That's the Jeffersonian ideal. We'll have these farmers spread out all over America, and we'll have this agricultural nation. All right. The War of 1812 is fought to secure the West. All right. It's also fought over our shipping territory too. But as far as what we get out of it, we get a secure West. All right. Remember, Monroe comes up with that Monroe Doctrine. You got to know that, right? The Monroe Doctrine and the position of neutrality are American foreign policy. We are going to stay over here in our little hemisphere. You stay over there in your hemisphere and leave us alone. No Europeans in our hemisphere, and we won't mess in your hemisphere. All right. Native American policy is going to be really important. As a general rule, Native American policy is removal. All right. Move the Native Americans off the land to give the white settlers more and more land to settle. All right, we're going to see that over and over again, especially with Jackson in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That's going to be huge. All right, the Black Hawk War is going to be fought in the Midwest to push the Native Americans out of Illinois and Wisconsin. We talked about that a little bit. The Cherokee are actually going to go to the Supreme Court to try to protect themselves, and they're actually going to get a Supreme Court ruling that says that you have to leave them alone. They're an independent nation. You need to leave them alone. All right, this is when Andrew Jackson says John Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it. He says, I'm going to do what I want anyway. The Supreme Court doesn't have an army to stop me. All right, so we have the president, Andrew Jackson, just telling the Supreme Court to screw off. I'm going to do it anyway. All right, and that's going to lead to the Trail of Tears, which is going to result in over 3,000 Cherokee deaths in the process. Lots of different battles that are going to take place as we move Native Americans off the land. All right, we talked a lot about them on the last slide. We're going to have Tippecanoe, which is a battle with the Native Americans, the Black Hawk War, Indian Removal Act, Trail of Tears, all kinds of them. However, over time, the Native Americans are just going to lose consistently, and despite the Supreme Court ruling in Worcester versus Georgia, they're going to continue to get moved off the land. All right. Again, as we expand west and as we get more and more land, the question then becomes, is it slave land or is it free land? Is it slave states or is it free states? And that's going to be really, really controversial. All right, we're going to get Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are going to be added as slave states. We're going to get plantations moved all over the area. All right, Florida is going to get added as a slave state. Texas is going to get added as a slave state. And we're going to get these border states that are going to not need slaves as much, but they're still going to have slavery, and they're going to get involved with selling their excess slaves, their surplus slaves, to the deep south where slavery is going to be really, really economically needed. All right, we talked a lot about the anti-slave stuff, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of that. All right, we get the Missouri Compromise, all right, that is going to split the country basically in half and say that the South is going to allow slavery and no slavery will be allowed in the North, especially north of that southern border of Missouri, which is going to be free for slaves forever. And we know that that's not really going to happen. All right. So again, Henry Clay is going to pop up to come up with this Missouri Compromise, which is going to bring in Missouri as a slave state, Maine as a free state. It's going to say that from now on we'll always have slave and free states coming in pairs. Nice idea, it just doesn't necessarily work. And the gag rule and censorship of that stuff's going to come. So there's period 4. A lot of information, pretty quick, guys. Hopefully it helps. Study, 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 and we'll go at it next week. Thanks.